Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Eco-Socialist Network Conference. And up next on our session is Howie Hawkins, a former Green Party presidential candidate, former multiple New York state governor's candidate for the Green Party, a founder, an activist, an organizer, and the original Green New Dealer, as we like to call him, the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal, which Howie will talk about during this session. Take it away, Howie.
So what I want to do is outline a history of the Green New Deal over the last 14 years, why it must be eco-socialist, what an eco-socialist Green New Deal is in comparison to earlier versions, and then address some of the issues that come up in these discussions about its cost, how to make it global, the question of the scarcity of rare earth minerals, and the question of degrowth and ending poverty. And I'm gonna stop at 30 minutes, even if I don't get through all that, because I'd like, I think discussion is a good way to get these, is just good for us to get understanding about these issues. So, I mentioned ending poverty. Ending poverty has always been part of the socialist tradition. In the 19th and 20th century, socialist movements emphasized developing the forces of production in order to end scarcity and poverty. But today we have a different problem. The forces of production are plenty productive, certainly to end scarcity and poverty. That's a question now of fairly distributing what we produce, but also transforming the forces of production, because what we now have as technology is destroying the planet. And we're not only talking about climate change, certainly we are that, but there's the violation of many of what are called planetary boundaries of sustainability, such things as ocean acidification, mass extinctions, which reduce biodiversity and ecosystem sustainability, the disruption of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, chemical and radioactive pollution in the environment, in our ecosystems, in our bodies. So eco-socialism has to transform the forces of production, as well as socialize ownership and democratize the administration of the means of production. So we have to go from fossil fuels to solar power, from chemicalized agriculture back to organic agriculture, and so forth. So we call it eco-socialism because the objective now is to meet the basic needs of everyone, to end poverty, but do so within ecological limits. So that's what we mean, I think, by eco-socialism. Now, we're talking about an eco-socialist Green New Deal, and the basics of the Green New Deal platform, and we've been talking about what's in the Green New Deal way before anybody was talking about a Green New Deal. I'm talking about in the 80s and 90s. In fact, in 2000, one of the branches of the divided Green Party movement back then, Green Party USA, had a plank called the Global Green Deal. And there was discussion about calling it the Global Green New Deal, but people said, no, New Deal is too associated with the Democratic Party. But it was the same thing, big investments in renewable energy to get the economy going and develop, particularly the Global South, on a basis that was ecologically sustainable. But where it really came into parlance within the Green Party movement and then around the world was the Green Party of England and Wales, coming out of the Great Recession in 2007, or not even coming out, responding to it. They talked about a Green New Deal that focused on clean energy investments to get the economy going, social programs to support the people, and banking reforms to deal with the causes of the financial and housing collapse that we had in 2007 and 2008. And then the European Greens picked that up and ran on the Green New Deal as their slogan and program for the 2009 Euro parliamentary elections. So I got nominated to run for the Green Party, for governor in New York in 2010. And I said, we should pick up that slogan. And I got resistance from some of the Greens in New York. Oh, we can't call it a New Deal. That's too associated with the Democratic Party. But we finally came around that it would be a good slogan. And the basics of our program, which I think remains the same, is that It's getting to 100% clean energy and zero emissions in a decade, which in 2010 was 2020. And it's really what the climate science was saying then. We just can't go back in time now. So we're in a worse position. Along with an economic bill of rights to jobs, income, housing, healthcare, and education. And particularly in our New York election, given who we are running against, Governor Austerity Cuomo, progressive tax reforms to pay for it. And so this slogan made a good contrast, kind of an ironic contrast to Cuomo, who is the epitome of neoliberal austerity, no tax hikes on the rich, cuts in social spending, was his response to the Great Recession. In fact, sometimes in our media, we call it the Hawkins Prosperity Program versus the Cuomo Austerity Program. So we started campaigning on a Green New Deal. Gloria Matera was the lieutenant governor candidate. We had 2 Senate races that year, Attorney General, Comptroller. We had a slate flyer that touted the Green New Deal as our overall theme for these programs. And by the end of the summer, some Greens in California had picked up on it, got Greens around the country to sign a statement for a federal Green New Deal, which dealt with issues, we weren't dealing with in a state election, like cutting the military budget to help fund this Green New Deal. And as the 2010s went on, it became the signature issue of the Green Party. I mean, the theme of Jill Stein's 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns was a Green New Deal for America. And Greens were running on it up and down the ballot. And then in 2018, what's interesting is that it went viral. It went to the national media because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ran as a Democrat on the Green New Deal. And she beat a leader in Congress, Joseph Crowley, one of the top 4 or 5 leaders. I forget his exact position, but he was up there with Pelosi. And it got a lot of attention. And then her campaign, or she went to a sit-in in Pelosi's office that the Sunrise Movement was doing, calling for a Green New Deal, and the mass media ate it up. And the irony there is she got the Green New Deal from the Green Party of New York. Her campaign manager, V.G. Ramos, had run Jabari Bridgeport's campaign for a city council seat from Brooklyn in New York City, and he ran on the Green Party's Green New Deal. So she's never acknowledged the authorship. But what happened after that, it went viral, is Pelosi totally rejected what Sunrise and AOC were demanding, which was a special Green New Deal committee that could put legislation right on the floor of the House. Instead, Pelosi wanted to run it through her fossil-fueled, climate and energy committees. And so AOC and Senator Markey of Massachusetts came up with a non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal that they introduced right away in the next session, early 2019. And, it's a real disappointment for us in the Green Party because it diluted the Green New Deal radically. It eliminated our demands for a ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is still the frontline demand of the climate movement, stopping pipelines like Enbridge Line 3, gas-fired power plants, and so forth. It eliminated the rapid phase out of nuclear power, eliminated the deep cuts in military spending to help pay for the Green New Deal. And it changed the goal from zero emissions to quote unquote net zero emissions, which of course opens the door to continued fossil fuel burning and greenhouse gas emissions, presumably mitigated by carbon capture and sequestration and carbon offsets, which have been around and don't do it. So it opened the door that way, and it extended the deadline for the goal 20 years, from 2030 at that point to 2050. And then Pelosi has never let the House vote on this non-binding resolution, which was really just a sense of the House. It really wouldn't have done anything. And Biden and Harris ran absolutely against the Green New Deal, and it came up in their debates. Bernie Sanders ran on it. I mean, one of the things we can say is the Green Party brought this into national debate, and Bernie had a pretty solid Green New Deal. We can go into details and question and answer if you want. And then we come to Build Back Better, which didn't come close to a serious climate program. Its social programs have neoliberal designs like emphasizing delivery by private companies and divisive means testing rather than universality. And so it's back to the Green Party to carry the Green New Deal. So in 2020, the details of the Green New Deal that I've always run on was full of socialist content like public power generation and distribution, public transportation, public housing, socialized health insurance through a single public payer, and so forth. But I think it's also true, many Greens have seen it, like Democrats do, as more a Keynesian approach of public investments in private business to stimulate the economy, and in particular, the development of clean energy systems. And that has its limits, which I'll talk about in a minute. So in our presidential campaign, that was one of the major reasons we called it an eco-socialist Green New Deal. So we distinguished ourselves from the AOC marquee Keynesian Green New Deal, which has a lot of private investment in private industry in the form of tax breaks and direct subsidies, loan guarantees, low interest loans for private businesses. In a word, corporate welfare. And it still relies on erratic market coordination rather than plan coordination through public ownership and democratic public planning. And probably most importantly, it keeps the corporations in charge of technology and investment decisions. It doesn't change the power relationships and democratize the economy. That's why we need an eco-socialist Green New Deal, where public ownership and planning changes the power relationships and puts the people in charge, not the corporations in charge, or not keeping them in charge, which is what Build Back Better and the AOC marquee Green New Deal did. So what we need to do is do what we did on a scale we did it during World War II, when the federal government took over a quarter of US manufacturing capacity in order to turn industry on a dime into what FDR called the arsenal of democracy, to arm the allies to defeat the fascist powers. We need to do nothing less through the public sector in order to defeat climate change. Except this time, unlike World War II, instead of handing over the public assets that the federal government controlled and actually built up and expanded, instead of just giving them back to the corporate elite, we want to keep these assets socially owned, democratically managed as public enterprises and worker cooperatives. So it depends on the industry. For example, power should be public power, public enterprise. Factories can be worker cooperatives, socially owned, but least to the worker cooperatives, if that's what the workers desire. In fact, in our Green New Deal program, we call for the federal government providing financing and technical assistance for the development of worker cooperatives, particularly in the manufacturing sector. So when we talk about public ownership and planning, that's what we need to coordinate the clean energy transition across sectors. This is not just about having clean, renewable electric power production, but also not burning fossil fuels and releasing other greenhouse gases and toxics in transportation, manufacturing, buildings, and agriculture. Because the transportation sector nationally is about 27% of our carbon footprint. What did I say? The power sector. Transportation is 29%. Manufacturing, I think, is 23%. Buildings, I think, is 13%, and agriculture about 10%. Those are roughly the numbers. So if we clean up power production and not the rest, we're not getting it done in terms of saving our bottoms from climate chaos. And then we need to coordinate, the supply chains of materials and manufacturing components and construct these things in the proper sequence as parts of a system. Otherwise, we'll get delays and bottlenecks if it's left to the markets. For example, in solar, private businesses won't build more solar without a smart grid that can handle it. And the profit-seeking utilities won't build a smart grid unless the solar capacity is already there. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. And that's what happens when you leave it to the market. That's why we need planning in that sector. You need to coordinate building mass transit lines and new public housing that is both, green in terms of its energy and material use, but also to deal with the affordable housing crisis. And also to build walkable communities that are much more resource and energy efficient. So you just can't have, like we do now, we give public money to private developers to build affordable housing, which isn't always affordable, often isn't. And then, mass transit lines they may get put in, but then the developers, are trying to grab the increased valued land sites. So it happens without coordination, and it doesn't benefit everybody, but just the people that are more privileged and have access to resources already. And then just to take manufacturing, it needs to be rebuilt, because what we got now is very dirty, on a clean power, zero waste basis. And it should be distributed into all regions. So every region has economic diversity for economic stability and self-reliance, and also more ecological sustainability based on energy and resource efficiency again, because you have less transportation needs. Or a Green New Deal for agriculture that's based on organic regenerative agriculture. It needs to be integrated with regional manufacturing for both agricultural inputs and machinery, and also food processing. So all this, the market, does it willy-nilly. We need to plan it, particularly given that we have, deadlines to meet carbon reduction goals if we're not going to go above the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, beyond which is it gets worse and worse. So, the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal that we ran on called for major public ownership in the power, transportation, manufacturing, and also financial sectors, so that we have public banks to help finance a lot of these projects, as well as public provision directly guaranteeing human rights in employment, housing, healthcare, lifelong public education from childcare to college, rather than paying private businesses to do these things, which Build Back Better is full of. It's the old neoliberal public-private partnership model that is more expensive and doesn't deliver for the people as well. And we also, in terms of a structure for public ownership and planning, emphasize a grassroots bottom-up democratic system based on locally elected governing boards and planning boards to do the detailed work locally of planning and administering these systems, whether it's public power or public housing or public transportation. And then those local boards elect members to a state board, and from there to a national board. So you have overall larger scale planning and coordination. That's a model of bottom-up democratic socialism that comes out of a bunch of models developed out of the New Left in the early 1970s. And I think that's the model that we should be producing. So I got 10 minutes to go through a bunch of issues, so I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. So let me pick a few. Well, I just talked about the public-private partnership. Let me just add this as an example. You got to give the Sunrise Movement credit for getting their big thing, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. They got an increase in its budget from $15 billion, which Biden originally proposed in his American Jobs Plan back in April, or maybe it was March. They got it up to $45 billion by the time the whole program had shrunk from over $6 billion in Biden's original proposals down to less than $2 billion. But they never criticized the neoliberal public-private partnership design of the program. And, public-private partnerships mean public contracts with private businesses to deliver services the government wants delivered, but it means the public pays and the private profits. And it means extra costs because of the administrative bureaucracy. The best example of that I think we're all familiar with is the overhead difference between private health insurance and Medicare, 30% versus 3%. And the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps, which is supposedly the model, was public jobs on public projects run by a public agency. The CCC picked the projects and hired the workers. Build Back Better's CCC, now a Civilian Climate Corps, was proposed to be run through AmeriCorps, which runs the VISTA program. So what that means is AmeriCorps will ask for private entities to, they'll put out a request for proposals, they'll get grant applications in, and then they'll read them all and administer them and have a bunch of hearings. So you're going to hire a whole layer of middle managers to administer the program, and the projects will be decided randomly by private entities rather than according to a coordinated public plan. So I think this is where, as eco-socialists, we've got to talk to our young comrades in Sunrise saying, hey, the Civilian Conservation Corps as proposed by the Democrats is it's not even as good as the Civilian Conservation Corps that the New Deal had. It needs to be a public program. Let's talk about the global Green New Deal. How do we make this global? Because, we can push for a federal Green New Deal. We can all push for local and state versions, which because they have to have balanced budgets, we're not going to be able to pay for a whole Green New Deal because it's going to require investing resources that we can't get just from taxation up front in order to deal with this emergency. But we can come up with programs for local governments and state governments. And then the part that we can't fund, we demand the federal government fund. And that helps build the movement for a federal Green New Deal. So, but the energy transition has to be global. We're at a point now where the global north, which has historically emitted the most, is now emitting less than the global south, which is industrialized, largely due to outsourcing by our corporations. So China, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, a lot of these countries, you put them together, they're actually emitting more carbon now than the global north. So we have got to have a global Green New Deal. And there are movements in all these countries at one level or another, from the European countries we're more familiar with to the independence movement in West Papua, which is trying to get their independence from Indonesia, which took them over. The indigenous people oppose that. And their program is, they call it's a Green New Deal program. It's a green something. I forget what the exact title is. But this is around the world. And so, the question is, how do we help people? In the Green New Deal budget that we ran on in the presidential campaign, we had $1 trillion over the 10 years in our budget set aside to help the global south build clean energy systems. And the US can do that. It's $100 billion a year. That's equal to what the world is committed in these global climate summits to what they call the Green Climate Fund. But in the, 12 years since that was adopted, they've only raised $80 billion total. And most of what they've raised, they're giving out as loans rather than grants, which isn't a big help to poor countries. Now, some people call this climate reparations. That's what it is, but we shouldn't see it as a sacrifice because it's an investment in the habitability of the planet for all of us, all of humanity. So it's an investment in our interests as well as the interests of these poorer countries. I think the other thing we need to consider in a global Green New Deal, or we can help incentivize it, is a carbon tax. Now, yes, this is a market incentive as well as a source of funds for Green New Deal investments. It can be progressive, should be progressive, with rebates to low and moderate income people because their carbon footprints are much lower than upper, middle, and high income groups. And it's not a substitute for public ownership and planning. A carbon tax alone will not transform the system in the way we need it on its own, but it can be part of the plan. And its global impact is that it's a tariff at the border. And so countries that want to import products to the US have an incentive because of this tax to lower the carbon content for their products, as well as our own producers. It's collected at the wholesale level. So I think those two pieces, we've got to, and this came up in Glasgow, and there was a good study. I didn't put the numbers in here, but basically a group of environmental groups, Friends of the Earth, Center for Biological Diversity, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and about 10 groups did a calculation that Biden was committed to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, which the program he put forward just cannot accomplish, but leave that aside. And they were saying, no, you got to do 195%, which means they said 70% domestically, but also whatever the remaining is, 125% more, because we're helping countries in the global South reduce their carbon footprints by helping them build clean, renewable energy systems. And that was what the US contribution should be. And, that's what's got to be part of the discussion of an eco-socialist Green New Deal. And I talked a little bit about degrowth and the energy poverty question. Let me just wrap up with this. Studies show, and I see David and Peter Schwartzman, or is Peter still on? Anyway, they are the ones that first brought this to my attention. And studies show that quality of life measured as the highest life expectancies in the world requires 3.5 kilowatt hours per person, measured as, power capacity available, or you can think of it as 3,500 kilowatt hours per year per person of energy consumed. Above that level, life expectancy doesn't increase. Below that level, it declines, and at about half that level, it declines radically. So, people talk about degrowth, but the fact is the world average now is 2.5, not 3.5 kilowatt hours per person. And for the poor countries, it's much lower. Meanwhile, the US average is over 12 kilowatt hours per person. That's about 3.5 times the energy needed for this highest quality of life. So we need to increase power production in the poorer countries of the world to end poverty, which is one of the goals of socialism, but decrease it in wealthy countries like the US. So the slogan degrowth, I think, needs to be deconstructed so that, yes, we need to degrow fossil fuels down to nothing, but we need to expand renewables. And, David and Peter Schwartzman, calculated that we need 32 terawatts of electric power capacity to bring the 9 billion people of the world will soon have up to 3.5 kilowatt hour per person capacity. The current world power capacity, electric power capacity, is 7.2 terawatts. That means we need to increase power capacity in the world 4.5 times to end poverty. And the renewable power capacity is only 2.8 terawatts, which means to get to this energy or energy poverty threshold, we need to get renewables, and we need to increase them by 11.5 times. So, Schwartzman, you should read their stuff. The book is called The Earth is Not for Sale. They got a website, solarutopia.org, and they've modeled how we can use fossil fuels in the transition to get a self-reproducing 100% renewable energy system, which gets to the rare earth minerals question, which I'm out of time, but I will just say they're not as rare as people think. The International Energy Agency estimates that it will take 6 times the minerals we now use to have a 100% clean energy system. So we've got to get them into a rebuild manufacturing system that's rebuilt around durable products and zero waste circular economy, so that the minerals, once we got them into the economy, are largely recycled to the maximum extent possible. And we need to socialize the minerals, which are the common wealth inheritance of humanity, and the big, mining companies like Rio Tinto and Anglo American and Newmont and Alcoa and the rest, so that we don't have the super exploitation of, for example, artisanal cobalt miners in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 250,000 of them, including 35,000 children who live, work in toxic conditions and are just totally underpaid. And this goes on all over the world, from the Andes to Papua New Guinea. So that sector can be socialized and made so that we extract the minerals in a way that's minimizes environmental damage and maximizes the benefit of our workers. And I'll close with these 2 facts. Some people say, I just got a question on my podcast, shouldn't we push degrowth instead of renewables? Because renewables require fossil fuels to produce. No, they don't. And you have all these, problems with rare earth mineral mining and extraction and so forth. But the amount of waste we get from the fossil fuel economy is much bigger than from renewables. One estimate comparing waste from fossil fuel economy to solar and wind it's 34,000 pounds per person per capita in the US under this fossil fuel dominated system. What would be released as waste under a renewable system would be about 100 pounds. 34,000 versus 100 pounds of waste. And the other thing to think about is 40% of the fossil fuels burned in shipping is burned shipping fossil fuels. So you go to a renewable system, right there, you've cut out 40% of the fossil fuel burning of fossil fuels. So, man, there's so much to talk about around this, but I think I'll stop there and let's go to people's questions and comments. And when I said end poverty, I was trying to say, get everybody up to that highest quality of life. And that's where the 3.5 kilowatt hour per person capacity, that's the threshold we got to meet. And the military spending cuts, that's why, it's so infuriating to see, AOC and Markey just dropped that from the Green New Deal. It's central to it, not just for the resources, but the monetary resources and the human resources, the people that are working on weapons could be working on clean energy, but also the physical resources that can be converted, like the minerals. Murray Bookchin used to talk about, we don't have to build so many mines. We got a lot of those minerals deposited in our waste dumps. So, we may be able to go through and extract a lot of minerals that have been used once and we can get back into the economy. And I just am about to put, you mentioned being concrete, the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal budget that I worked on with John Wren, who he came out with a book when we were running on the Green New Deal in 2010 called Manufacturing Green Prosperity, arguing for the importance of manufacturing for this energy transition. A lot of times people say, oh, it's industrial pollution, we just got to stop, shut down all the factories. But we need those factories to produce the renewable energy equipment and all the other goods we use. Question is how we do it. He's a political economist. He was a protege of Seymour Melman. Those of you older folks may remember him. He was the industrial engineer at Columbia that used to come up with schemes for peace conversion of the military to civilian production and argued strenuously against the export of our factories overseas to low-wage, repressive areas of the world, and was an expert in worker cooperatives. So that's who John was. So we went through all the sectors using current pricing to figure out what it would cost. And they're ballpark estimates, but we came up with, for the energy transition, 27.5 trillion. For the economic bill of rights, 14.1 trillion. That's over 10 years. So it's 42 trillion over 10 years. That would double the federal budget. But if you're going to meet the people's needs and deal with this climate emergency, we're going to have a lot more going through the public sector than the private sector. And we shouldn't apologize for that. And so you can look at the Green New Deal budget. We talk about how to pay for it, as well as what it would cost. And we're going to update it. The tax reform proposals in there can be much improved. And I just got to do a couple more figures or get help with them. And we're going to put a new tax reform proposal up in there. Getting in the fight improves your mood and your optimism, because it's good to fight with other people for what's right. And it gives you a better attitude. But that doesn't change the reality that, yes, we're already deep into climate change. We're seeing the consequences. Those other, can't remember if I mentioned it here or before in another talk about planetary boundaries. We have a whole slew of environmental crises that we're facing. So we got to talk about adapting as well as, transforming how we produce, adapting to the changes that are coming, because they are coming. If you live in Miami, your house is very likely going to be underwater. It's already, the sea is coming in up from below in parts of the city. We've got droughts, we've got heat waves. So there's that kind of adaptation. But I think we need to emphasize it as part of the mass politics of, a eco-socialist movement. Lifeboats, I don't think are going to be effective, because if they're isolated and you have a mass of misery around you where people, are looking for resources, a lifeboat may not be that safe. So I'm not sure if I, got what you meant about that, but.
No, I said they should be lifeboats and base camps from which we operate for social change as engaged, totally engaged. I mean, when I work within, I'm working now with a Altair Eco Village in Kimberton, Pennsylvania, and my role within that movement is to bring in the perspective of these being base camps for social change. So that's just another aspect of the kind of work that we can do.
Okay, yeah, I just caution against the survivalist retreat.
Oh, yeah.
We got to be engaged, right?
Well.
So I think Gloria is the next person.
Thanks, Howie, and thanks for your talk. So I think earlier in our opening, Kali really referred to, he was trying to talk about, so like, where are the possibilities? He mentioned the youth movement. Wasn't particularly specific, but obviously they were a big presence at COP. In fact, just yesterday on the news, they were interviewing a number of young people who had gone. They didn't say they were from various organizations, but who were at COP 26. Of course, expressing their disappointment and saying that, like, no one's done anything. They could have done something. It's political will. So they have the answer there in terms of, like, they know why it's not being done. I just wondered, just from your experience, have you connected with any of the youth movements? What do you hear? And looking at those of us who are in kind of present today, how do we really forge those relationships or see where that might be going? People, in fact, are talking. I know Mark's been involved with this with the Eco Action Committee for the party, Green Party, which is, there's some kind of big youth mobilization on March 25th, which is a month from Earth Day, but kind of wondering, is there ways to partner with that, or what you might be hearing on the ground?
Well, mostly I've heard from Sunrise Movement. I think they call them hubs. They're locals who've asked me to speak, and a lot of it's because they get it. An eco-socialist Green New Deal is what we really need, and they want to hear more about it. And I find that these kids, and they are junior high school kids, as much as college kids, they know more about the issue, the numbers, the data, the history, than people in the climate movement who are activists mobilizing. It's really encouraging. I guess that's because they're in school and they're used to studying and they really do a job. But I think the way we connect with them is where they are in our communities. We go out, and when they have an action, we show up and we build personal relationships with them. And they have good organizing techniques that we can learn from, and we have policy perspectives and so on that maybe they can learn from. But I think it's just old-fashioned organizing. Go out and engage the youth that are in motion. They have their own networks, and if you build trust with them, they will come to you and tell you what they're doing, ask for advice, invite you to come. That's it's just the old kind of organizing that we got to do. And I think sometimes older folks. I remember this when I was a teenager in the San Francisco Bay Area. A lot of movements going on back then, and even the 20-somethings that said don't trust anybody over 30 didn't listen to what I was saying as a teenager. It's like I didn't speak as we went around the room. So give the youth space, and a lot of them are really going to impress you because they've really boned up on this, and it's their future. They really, got a vested interest in it.
Howie, this is David Cobb. Thank you so much for a fantastic session. I know that there's thank you, David Schwartzman. I know that your hand is up, but we have heard from you and we are coming to the end. So I do want to give you a chance for any final thoughts. A reminder that we have 2 more sessions coming up. So Michael O'Neill has been doing a great job. Remember that there is, in this room, there'll be the case study of the Green Party of California and how it adopted a explicit eco-socialism platform plank. So stay here for that one. Go to B link, which Michael will drop into the chat if you want to go to the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network's session with Emily Kawano and Michael O'Neill. So Howie, any final thoughts?
Well, I'll put the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal budget back in the chat for those that got here late, didn't see it before. And, you know, take a look at that. We got to update it. It's now a few years old, and we welcome your comments. And, you know, some people were talking about, yeah, it's really bad, you know, what's happening with the climate and these other environmental problems. But, you know, we're the people that, you know, got an answer for that and is needed now. And we need you to be part of that movement. So what's the old slogan? Don't mourn, organize, you know, and like I said, you get engaged.
Don't whine, organize. That's another one.
Don't what?
Don't whine, organize is another one I like to use.
Yeah, okay. But, you know, and like I said, you get involved in a movement with other people and it just improves your attitude and gives you the strength to keep going. So see y'all at the barricades.